welcome everyone once again to Calvary Conversations. I will be your host for this session, Joshua Paxton, Director of the Burnham Center for Global Engagement here at Calvary, and I am joined today by the usual suspects, Shaun LePage, Director of our Ministry Studies program, Tim Hange, education teacher in our English department, teacher in our English department. Oh, both. There we go. And also program director for our TESOL program. And then joining us today, we have a special guest, Josh Johnson. Don't get your Joshes too confused here. He is the Dean of Students here at Calvary. And so we are delighted to have him with us today as we continue our conversation related to Generation Z and their thoughts on evangelism. And so last week we introduced this topic from some articles that Barna had published about Generation Z and how they view evangelism. I have procured the actual research study from them, and so we want to spend some time delving into some of the key findings from this research study. So in particular, the two key questions that are really in front of us today are how can we prepare Gen Z Christians to share their faith? So how can we be more proactive in preparing them to share their faith? And then how can we engage with non-Christian Gen Zers? So those are really the two main questions that are going to be in front of us as we consider these findings. And so last week, we dove into this topic and we didn't really define very well who Generation Z is. And so Barna's research studies particularly focused on Gen Zers who are 13 to 18 years old. That was the age range for which they conducted their study, so mainly teens. However, Generation Z, otherwise known as the I generation or the net generation, their age range is actually between 1995 and 2010. So the oldest Gen Zer is 27 years old. The youngest Gen Zer is 12. My twins just got in on this generation barely. And so keep in mind that Generation Z is a much broader group than just the sample size for our research here. So now I've done quite a bit of research on Generation Z for my dissertation, and so some identifying characteristics of this generation, right? Number one, they are always on. They are constantly connected to the global world through information technology. Theirs is a world in which the internet has always existed. They have never known a time before this thing called the internet, and it shapes their everyday experience. All right, two, their most common learning platform, YouTube. If they want to know something, they will look up a YouTube video on it and they will figure it out. So they prefer andragogy or adult education teaching methods to pedagogical or children teaching methods, which basically means they want to be more involved in their education. Because they're used to having access to the technology, they're used to searching for answers, and so they want to be involved in what they're learning as opposed to just being, lectured at. So, contrary to millennials who experienced the economic boom of the 90s, their childhood has been marked by the Great Recession from 2007 to 2009, the war on terror, unprecedented school shootings, and now COVID, which remains to be seen what impact that will have on them. And so they have a strong desire for safety and economic security, as well as making the world a better place. They have a collective aversion to offending others. And that's going to show up a little bit in some of the research that we've seen here. So they are the most ethnically diverse generation in history, a trend which will only continue to grow. They are the first post-Christian generation. Only 4% of Gen Zers have a biblical worldview. And then they have been called Gen Z, not just because they're the last letter of the alphabet, but they have been called the final generation. And the reason behind that is because the rate of technological change will continue to increase to such an extent that it will be pointless to define different generations. It will just be so rapid. Change will be so rapid and so frequent that you won't be able to look at those significant generational markers anymore. And so for this study,
that's not like
yes,
a prediction of the rapture then, huh?
Yeah,
the final generation.
We can hope. So, all right. So we want to dig into some of these findings, and I'm going to pick on Josh Johnson the most because he's here. And so, all right. So number one, U.S. Christian teens believe how they live their life should be their primary witness to non-Christians. And so we touched on this a bit last week as well, but 50%, half of Christian Generation Z, say that letting your actions speak rather than using words to explain your faith is an act of evangelism. So, Josh Johnson, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, as I watched you guys last week, what struck me when Tim mentioned proclamation versus incarnation, I was wondering, is this a pendulum swing? Is it just a pendulum swing from where their grandparents were? Maybe not parents, but maybe parents too. And the pendulum is swung probably too far. I would say had to be going a little bit too far to say that the proclamation of the gospel doesn't have to be with words. That's a problem for me. But the proclamation of the gospel without a life that supports the belief in, the consideration of Jesus and what he can do in your life, that's a bigger problem. That's a bigger problem in my opinion. So, and I think it was in God's opinion, in his word, when he saw people that did not have a life, like in Amos. I was looking at Amos chapter 5. People that did not have a life that supported what he desired for them. He said to them, take away the noise of your songs. I will not even listen to the sound of your harps, but let justice roll out like waters. And if that was happening in their life, I think then he would definitely want to listen to their worship and listen to their words.
Mm-hmm. What percentage was that, Josh? What percentage of them believed that?
50%.
50%. So the other half
split right down the middle. So one of the other interesting findings, which kind of goes along with this a little bit, non-Christian teens prefer to be approached by Christians who let actions speak louder than words. Now, I think let me just real quick. I think it's important to understand that they see the importance of actions. They're not necessarily saying actions instead of words, right? Like, actions are important, not that words are unnecessary. I think that's maybe an important distinction. So, Tim, Shaun, thoughts?
Yeah, well, that's why I asked what the percentage was, is because and the wording is important too. I think as you say, it's not saying actions rather than words necessarily. Because actually, as I think about that, I don't think that's a generational thing. I think even going back to ancient times, in the last century, I remember a whole debate about this. Somebody whose name escapes me wrote a book called Friendship Evangelism in like, I don't know, like 1970 or something like that. And I remember as a new Christian in the 80s that there was this debate about, well, if we focus too much on friendship, then we'll never get to the evangelism. And if we focus on evangelism, we're not as effective. And so I don't think that's a generational debate. I think that's just been one of those things that Christians have struggled with all along.
But I did see a difference between my my parents' generation and my generation. I'm part of Gen X, just kind of at the front end of it.
Now, Tim. No one talks
Yes.
about Gen X.
Oh, I do. So yeah, no, but Gen X very very much had this similar vibe, and I mean, how often have I heard the supposed quote, which turns out I don't think is actually attributable to him, Saint Francis of Assisi, preach the gospel and if necessary use words.
Right.
Apparently he didn't say that. Now the passage escapes me, but Paul preach the gospel, be ready, in season and out of season. That is a certainly a more biblical model. But that said, I am a person who leans far more in my 8 years in missions. Friendship evangelism was the way that I went, because I recognize that people do need to see the genuine care for the individual before they'll listen to a message that you have to say, and making that kind of interweaving the two seems matches my own vibe. So I would say that Gen Z, like, I don't think it's wrong to say that Gen Z, to point out that Gen Z highly prefers that. But I think, Shaun, as you kind of hinted at, that's been building that direction for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But there.
So I got to throw in another finding here, because really they all kind of tie together. And so like, as both of you were mentioning, there was a time when, and maybe still is, there's this debate: do we let our actions speak? Do we actually preach the gospel? Of course, whether it's 2 Timothy or it's Jesus speaking in Mark 16:15, preach the gospel, right? The word is proclaimed. Words are necessary. However, actions are important too. So maybe it's not an either or, but the reality is it's a both and here. So one of the other findings: Gen Z teens view sharing their faith as relational, something they do with people they already know and trust. So 4 in 5, 82% agree that having a conversation about faith is most effective when you have already established a significant relationship with that person. And so I feel like this bleeds into the other two, in that it's not just that actions are more important or that words are more important, but the reality is these two things have got to be integrated. So Josh Johnson, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, my first thought on that is that it makes so much sense, because they can be connected with anyone they share the gospel with. They can be connected to that person that they meet in downtown KC when they're walking around, and they could share the gospel with them there. But it's probably more likely that they get their number, they get their Snapchat, they get their information, they talk to them about something serious, whether it's the gospel yet or not, and then they stay connected, even if they're not in the same region, not in the same country. They can make that connection, keep it, show that they seriously care about the person, and in there somewhere share the gospel with them. Makes sense.
Yeah. That has been one of, whether it's been, getting to know students here on Calvary's campus, or it's been doing some of my research for my dissertation, the highly relational aspect of this generation. Millennials get a bit of a bad rap sometimes, right, about being so immersed in technology, and it's almost like the pendulum has swung the other direction now, to where Generation Z can use the technology, they're familiar with it, they've grown up with it, but they prefer real life on life, face-to-face relationships, and their utilization of the technology doesn't replace the relationship, it merely extends the relationship. Good. Tim, Shaun? Or yeah.
Yeah, and just 20 years ago, 25 years ago, to keep the connection with that person that you meet on this, in your random time in your life, that would have been a lot harder, for sure.
It was. It took a much greater deal of intentionality, and you actually had to remember phone numbers rather than putting them in your cell phone.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and I think think this again, I just don't think this would be I don't think you would get a vastly different answer from other generations. So I think the thing I'm picking up on here is that we have a lot in common. Actually, we have the most important things in common with Gen Zers, and this is an example because I think most of us. I mean, I certainly would agree that having a relationship with somebody is just the best context in which to help them understand the faith. I think we could all also agree that there are just some people who are gifted evangelists, and they can meet somebody on a plane or sit down next to a stranger somewhere and just really have an incredible conversation with them, if not actually lead them to Christ. But again, I just think we're all created in the image of God, right? We all it's universal to mankind that we want to belong and we want to have purposeful lives, and because we're created in the image of God, I believe we all yearn for a relationship with God. And so I think this stat to me just reemphasizes that we have a lot more in common than not.
Tim, did you have something?
I think we do share that in common, but I also think that, at least for my part, I am old enough, or we've seen in movies, etc. My parents are old enough to remember a time when you could stand on a street corner and preach, and a crowd would gather. As opposed to now, if somebody stands on the street corner and preaches, right, people are just going to hurriedly walk by. I do think it is important to recognize that we live in an age now, especially, as Gen Z, grows, and as we see their trends continue, to where public proclamation needs to take it is probably going to take a back seat. I mean, there'll be little role for it outside of a gathering like a church. So, yeah, I hear what you're saying, Shaun, but I do think it's more pronounced in this generation than it is even in mine and yours. So
we too quickly run out of time on these things, but we've still got about 8 minutes. But three of the findings here, let me go through real quick because they pointed a very interesting trend. So number one, the majority of Christian Gen Z is having faith conversations with non-Christians. So 78% of Christian teens have shared their faith with a non-Christian in the past year. So a lot of them are actually having these conversations. Faith sharing is more than a one-time event for American teens. Spiritual conversations typically involve some kind of follow-up. Afterward, Christian teens gain more confidence in sharing their faith. So they're sharing their faith, they're doing it often, they're gaining confidence. However, teens, so this is 13 to 18-year-olds, teens feel the best outcome of a spiritual conversation would be to better understand one another. So note their goal in sharing their faith. Right, so 38% of Christian Gen Zers would agree with this following statement. It is wrong to share one's personal belief with someone of a different faith in hopes that they will one day share the same faith. So 38% is sharing their faith. They're sharing their faith regularly, but their goal is distinctly not conversion. They would say that having the goal of conversion is wrong. So we'll start back over at the top. Josh, what do you think about that?
There's a lot there.
There is a lot there.
The first few things you mentioned, I feel like we mentioned beforehand that their favorite learning platform is YouTube, and they can be prepared for these conversations. And that, I feel like that's why 80% of them are having these conversations, because they can go back and look and say, boy, I don't understand that idea. I want to study it. I want to find out. Again, when I was a child, as a 42-year-old, and when I was a child, I didn't necessarily have an option like that. Even people in my life at times that would have had answers for these questions. So they're more prepared, so they can have these conversations. But yeah, that 38% is, it's a little scary, and I don't exactly have a good thought on it right now.
Well, that's a good one right there. Just the quality of, so you're 42, I'm 42. We're I think we have a quad rattle of Gen Xers here. Yeah, Gen X. But if we wanted to find something out when we were growing up, we had to find a person, or somebody had to teach us. Gen Z, if they want to know something, they look it up on their phone and they figure out what it is, and that is a very important distinction. So, Tim, you started to say something.
Yeah, so I'm probably not as wigged out by that 38% statistic as you. So it depends on what they mean. Can you read that again? 38% think that the goal of, if I heard you correctly.
This is so here's the exact quote. Okay. This is the question that they actually asked. It is wrong to share one's personal belief with someone of a different faith in hopes that they will one day share the same faith.
Okay. I would say that's a pretty strong, like, I would not personally agree with that. I think that needs to be part of the mix. But what would not surprise me is if Gen Z is reacting to highly agenda-driven evangelism that places the person as an end, and they realize that in the conversation. I'm being proselytized right now. That really turns me off. You're not interested in me. You're not interested in a relationship with me. See, I think that high relationship drive goes hand in hand with this finding. I think it's helpful to have conversations with Gen Z to understand that it's okay to have a goal, an agenda, right? But that can also coexist with a genuine relationship with an individual, right? But it also may smack to the realities of of living in a pluralistic culture, where we recognize that a person who is seen as proselytizing is considered that's considered in a very negative lens. So it is often better, and I find myself in these situations, even though I have the agenda, but where I'm information exchanging rather than openly trying to convert, and praying that the Word of God speaks through that, because that's the best that can happen in that situation. It's always the best that can happen, but I can't shove that along. I can't pressure that. It's going to have to be just the Word of God that does that, because the context dictates that. Does that make sense? And I think they're in those contexts a lot.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And and number one, in part, perhaps it's a reaction to the evangelism explosion type mentality, where we need to get unbelievers as another notch on our belt, and that kind of agenda driven, and which gets in the way. That can get in the way of actually having a real honest relationship with somebody. Really having a relationship without this kind of agenda. So I'm reminded of Nabil Qureshi. And so Nabil Qureshi has passed away. He's moved on to glory now, but he writes in his book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, about how he had plenty of Christian friends growing up, going to an American high school, but all of them treated him as if he was a project. He as soon as they realized he wasn't going to convert to following Christ, they would stop the relationship. And so that really turned him off to the whole thing. Understandably, right? None of us want to be somebody else's project. And so what actually led to him finding Christ was somebody who was willing to really personally invest in having a relationship with him, whether he ever became a Christian or not. So, and guys, we constantly have too little time. We're down to 30 seconds.
All right, let me
give us the last word, Shaun.
That 38%. So a couple of things. First of all, that tells me that at least 6 out of 10 would disagree with that statement, which is encouraging.
Right.
Then the 38%, this is one of the things I really enjoyed about sitting down with, as you talked about last week, Josh. We sat down with a group of Calvary students last week and asked them what their thoughts were on this, and we were able to, immediately ask, well, what do you mean by that, and get clarification. So I'd like to sit down with that 38% and get that clarification. What were you thinking, exactly when you responded to this? And I think that would be helpful. And, we're also talking here about teenagers, right? 13 through 18. And so, yeah. And you said a very small percentage of them had ever had evangelism training. So it makes sense to me. And I think, I can imagine that they could easily have been emphasizing what you guys were talking about, like hardcore offensive kind of evangelism, and instead just be emphasizing that we need to build relationship, which also matches up with your descriptions of Gen Z.
Good. Yeah. Speaking on that, so the very last finding on here, just 19% of Christian Gen Z have received some kind of evangelism training. And so that's, that right there should be a bit of a clarion call to our churches and our, even our environment here. How are we training and preparing them to engage in these kind of faith conversations with people? So, all right, we are out of time. So Josh, thank you for joining us today and lending your insight to this conversation. It seems like this is one that could just keep going and going and going. So if you're listening to us today and you want to keep this conversation going, then do so. We have ways of getting in touch with us here at Calvary and everything. And so we would love to talk with any of you. And if you want to engage in Gen Z, if you want to be involved in some evangelism training, we've got tools for that too. So thank you everyone for being with us for today's conversation. God bless.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Calvary Conversations, a service of Calvary University in Kansas City, Missouri. We invite you to participate in the conversation by contacting us through the Calvary University website, calvary.edu, or by calling us at 816-322-0110. Join us again next week for another Calvary Conversation.